David, let's move on to the European Parliament then. Now, I saw a story today, there's a bit of a corruption scandal going on in the European Parliament at the moment.
There is, but that's not what I'm focusing on here. I've got a talk here that was given by a Polish professor of philosophy and historical philosophy and modern politics. So a man who thinks about things. And this was at the 70th anniversary of the European Parliament. And he had some things to say that they didn't want to hear. This speech, only 2 minutes long, is fascinating. The reaction of the parliamentarians, equally fascinating.
Madam President, Prime Ministers, 2 minutes of truth, of bitter truth. And the bitter truth is that the European Parliament has done a lot of damage in Europe. It has been sending a false message. It represents European demos. There isn't, and there won't be, any European demos. The Parliament infected Europe with shameless partisanship. And the infection became so contagious that it spread to other institutions, such as the European Commission. The Parliament has abandoned the basic function of representing people. Instead, it has become a machine to implement the so-called European project, thus alienating millions of voters. The Parliament has become a political vehicle of the left to impose their monopoly with their fierce intolerance towards any dissenting view. No matter how many times you repeat the word diversity, diversity is becoming an extinct species in the European Union, and particularly in this chamber. The Parliament is a quasi-parliament because it rejects the essential principle of parliamentarism, namely accountability. The deputy, let me remind you, is elected by the voters and must be accountable to the voters that elected him. Not so in the European Union. The idea that, say, Spanish, German, French, etc., deputies accountable to their own national electorates can dictate something to, shall we say, a Hungarian society or any other society to which they cannot be held accountable and which cannot take them to task is simply preposterous. Call it what you will, but democracy it is not. To sum up, the Parliament represents the demos that does not exist, works for the project that ignores reality and law, shuns accountability, turns its back on millions of people, and serves the interest of one political orientation. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Having said that, ladies and gentlemen, I rest my case.
So, fascinating comments. A parliament that ignores reality and law There's no accountability. He could be talking about Holyrood. I mean, goodness, he could almost be talking about Westminster these days. That's historically been the best of the parliaments, and is that not true of Westminster as well? I particularly like some of the shots of the audience, the cognitive dissonance that was visible in their faces. And there was one point, there was two people who were just chatting because they were reacting as though he wasn't there. It was an unexpected intermission. That's how they were responding. They were responding as though he was not speaking at all because they were unable to process what he was saying. A really strange psychological reaction amongst the parliamentarians. But didn't he do well?
He did. Now let's move on to Russian matters. And well, Angela Merkel made a statement over the weekend or a few days ago, which was quite incredible in many ways. We mentioned this on Friday. I think the Minsk Agreements, Angela Merkel said, were an attempt to give time to Ukraine. It also used this time to become stronger, as can be seen today. The Ukraine of 2014, 2015 is not the modern Ukraine. So in other words, what she's basically saying here is that they deliberately they set up the Minsk Agreements with the deliberate intention of giving Ukraine time to rearm and take on Russia. Now, the Russian response to this, Putin's response to this, was quite interesting. So here he is. He said, honestly, this was a complete surprise to me. This is disappointing. Frankly speaking, I did not expect to hear this from the former Federal Chancellor because I always thought that the leaders of the Federal Republic of Germany were sincere with us. Of course, they were on Ukraine's side and supported Ukraine, but I still thought they'd always been sincerely striving for a settlement. What you have just said only shows that we did everything right by starting the special military operation. Why? Because it transpired that nobody was going to fulfill these Minsk agreements. That's quite an admission from her and quite a response.
It's an incredible admission, but of course it says very clearly nobody can trust Merkel or the EU. So to hear those comments by the gentleman in the EU just says it all. The EU is not to be trusted because it will be working for war while it says it's working for peace.
Indeed. So if the West is working for war, what are the Russians doing in the meantime? Well, here's Dmitry Medvedev, and he's basically saying that they are rearming, but he's saying it's much more difficult for them. The Russians, our enemy, has dug in not only in the Kiev province, but also in Europe, North America, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and a whole host of other contemporary Nazi-sworn places, as he describes them. Therefore, he said, we're increasing the production of the most powerful means of destruction, including those based on new principles. So the Russians absolutely getting behind their so-called exotic weaponry that seems to work. In the meantime, Maria Zakharova had this to say, or warned the United States that if the US continues with their threat to provide Ukraine with long-range weapons, that would be a red line as far as as far as Russia would be concerned. I would make the United States a direct party to the conflict, even though the Russians already recognize that in fact they are a direct party to the conflict. The Russians are still stepping back from that position, but this clearly would be a red line for them.
Well, I think this is also prompted by the recent attacks on Russian air bases by the Ukrainians with some very old drones. So the Russians now are putting the red line down. Do they mean it? I would say they do.
Yes.
Because they cannot back down because, of course, they're being attacked by virtually the whole of the Western world with the excuse of NATO.
And then the EU was very proud to announce on the 10th, on Saturday, that they have adopted an 18 billion euro assistance package for Ukraine. But when we actually look to see what it is, we find that it's loans with a 10-year grace period, but loans nonetheless. But what grabbed me here, David, was that member states will cover the bulk of the interest costs during this 10-year grace period. Via so-called external assigned revenues. Now, I didn't know what external assigned revenues were, so here's a description of what they are. The EU budget is governed by the principle of universality. This means that there's no direct link between the source of the revenue collected and the expenditure that it finances. So you just get a pot of money and we can spend it as we like. There is an exception to this rule, and that is assigned revenue, meaning specific revenue which is collected to finance specific expenditure. So in this case, the specific expenditure that's being financed is the interest payments on the loans that they're passing to Ukraine with a so-called grace period?
Well, can I speculate that we might be financing, or NATO and the EU might be financing that by using resources robbed from the Russians?
Yeah, it's quite possible, yes.